population living under the poverty line, these technologies have really enhanced the quality of life of people. And another observation in this regard is that the mobile phone has become a hub of different assistive technologies. Now, if you give people multiple devices, we have found that they are unlikely to maintain all these devices separately. Whereas if you club them all into one device, the chances of people looking after these things and using it on a daily basis becomes much better. Obviously, not all the...
Still not working. Could I suggest that you get the microphone close to your mouth?
Try the other one.
I can try the next one.
Try the other microphone.
Yeah, so I hope this is better. Can the transcriber hear me? This is Satish for the transcript. Oh, it's a machine, is it? Okay, I think I need assistive technology here to get going.
You're talking to a machine that's doing the translation?
Right, so I'll just summarize now. Yeah, let me just...
It's IoT, that's right.
We have to get your mouth right on top of it. Loud as I am.
Well, I think most people here can hear me, so I wonder what the problem is. Yeah, so I was saying that not all assistive devices work on the mobile phone-based technologies, but those that can be brought on the mobile phone makes it much easier for people to use it. And this is perhaps the only computer they're ever going to have in their lives. So it makes a lot of sense to do that. I have some more comments, but let me see if we can get this sorted out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Satish. And yeah, so my audio is working, and maybe Satish, if you could try another mic.
It might
yeah.
not be on our side at all.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll see how we go when we continue. But for now, I'll pass over to Martin Butterman to make some opening remarks, please.
Okay, challenging the machine or the transcriber. Maarten Botterman, I'm on the ICANN board, member of the ICANN board. I'm speaking here more in my capacity as chairman of the Dynamic Coalition of IoT. We just had a meeting. And really it's about, if you look at the IGF, it's about how do you get to something sensible at global level. Ultimately, that will need to be transposed to something useful at local level, locally. And I think most importantly, it's for us to realize that if we make something, if we think about something, if we develop something, whether it's a policy or a thing, our reference model is where we are. And from that, we try to get ahead. And in particular, if you move towards people with special needs, it's so crucial what Vint introduced at the beginning, that we ask them, does this work for you? Because I can think of things, but I don't know. So involvement is important, and that involvement, those people who are active in promoting this, please try to get that organized, help to get that organized. Industry obviously has a focus on making money. That's where the biggest drive is, that's where technology develops fastest. Now there's two things that can help here. One is where governments or even civil society may say, I want to sponsor this. It may not be a pure market opportunity like many others, like the Fitbit or the Google glasses. Sorry for using that name. But make it possible to sponsor it, make it possible, lower the threshold, make it more interesting to invest in that. That is one thing. The second thing is that thanks to the market being global, is that if you address a very small part of the people who need it, but you manage to reach them well, again, directly via the internet or via Google, because people Google for things. This is in the positive sense, of course. And or via those civil society organizations that help organize that. That means that a tool made in Paris or in Johannesburg or wherever in the world can be sold all over the world, and that's new too. So my emphasis is really get involved, trigger the interest, and for those of civil society and government around it, let's stimulate that. I know my colleague Paul from the European Commission has seen much more about that. The future will bring more Internet of Things, and it will bring what we clearly ask for. If we sit back and we wait for it to come to us, that may not work very well in the case of special needs. So really, again, get out there, get interested, and get your networks together. I think I'll leave it to there for this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're getting a theme here of involvement. People with disability, very important aspect. Paul Timmers, please.
Let me, in a few minutes, just give a few words as a former policymaker. I think there are really 3 points that I would like to make. One is, I think, this meeting, this dynamic coalition, and the focus on IoT and accessibility for people with disabilities is really timely. It's really the kind of thing that you need to do right now. It's very relevant. Secondly, in terms of content, I think there's a real need to illustrate a lot more what accessibility means in terms of IoT. We have to make it visible in real-life cases that are understandable for the IoT community. And the IoT community in a wide sense, the policymakers, the industry that is providing IoT solutions, and let's say the sectors in whether this is health or home systems or automotive that are going to use IoT. The third point is about governance. There's quite a challenge to get that message across in the big world of global IoT that is developing explosively. And there are very limited resources. And I don't have an answer there, but that's, I think, a serious point of discussion. Let me just give a few links to policy. I have actually had the privilege to go to a few IoT conferences this year. And there's talk about all kind of sectors where IoT will be applied, including homes and health, but nothing about accessibility that I actually found there. I've followed the work of the Alliance on Internet of Things Innovation, the IoT, and they actually do spend time on accessibility. They also link up with standardization. They at least analyze it, but they do not yet come really with solutions. And as said, ETSI, for example, in the field of standards, does analyze and identifies gaps, but not necessarily how to fill the gap. In September, I also had the pleasure to go to a big conference of the Assistive Technology Association of Europe, the AAAT, and there was exactly one session about IoT, but lots of sessions about assistive technology. And I was also in a European-wide debate about the next generation internet, and that's in a wide sense. So people mentioned there IoT, data, big data, AI, 3D printing, robotics, blockchain, what have you. And perhaps we have to talk about that wide scope. And they touch upon inclusion and accessibility, but only touch upon. So there are many issues that, many places where perhaps accessibility can get better into the picture in combination with IoT. The potential is there, but it does not yet really happen at scale. Yet, in terms of policy, there are also quite a number of hooks, but it's a bit of the same story. There are quite a number of hooks, but it's not really strongly anchored, the voice around accessibility. So in Europe, for example, critical around IoT is what are you going to do with the data that are coming from these devices, from IoT environments. So there is an initiative around, which is called free flow of data. And that's really actually more about access and use of the data. That's a perfect opportunity to move into it with demands and understanding around accessibility. And even time-wise, that policy still needs to be fully formulated in the course of next year. It's a moment in time to grab. But if it doesn't happen, the policy is going to be there, and the moment in time has passed. Same story about what we talked about this morning, certification of cybersecurity certification. There too, accessibility can enter and the moment is still there. On the other hand, you also have to be very realistic. I was at co-writing the Web Accessibility Directive in 2010, 2011. We started negotiating in 2012. Ultimately, we got a watered-down Web Accessibility Directive accepted in Europe in 2016. It takes us 4 years, and there is no IoT there. It still needs to be really applied to it. There's a relevance for IoT, but it still really needs to be interpreted, and I think Shadi is doing some of that work to get it properly interpreted. So my kind of conclusions, to be short here, is I would say there are plenty of hooks in initiatives, IoT initiatives, and in policy, in current and in emerging policy, and also in research and innovation. But even if these hooks are there, at the moment they are really soft hooks. And you have to be taking into account if it is about political decision making on accessibility, it's taking a lot of time. It's going to go slow. And the digital debate is much faster. It's driven by innovation and it's driven by money, and that's a fast debate. So the time is now, but it's not trivial to make use of it. And actually the debate around policy, digital policy, is rather uninformed around accessibility. So there's an opportunity there to provide much better information, guidance for existing policy, how to interpret that, and also guidance in policy negotiations like around the European Accessibility Act. And then finally, I find that there is not a really strong informed, strong organized and strong resourced voice around IoT accessibility. That's a pity, but we'll have to work with limited resources, have to be smart. I must say, I think some of the disability organizations could actually also do more, be closer involved in innovation, because innovation is actually also, in a certain sense, a tool to realize rights, a policy tool.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have a lot of big issues there to consider, and I think again we hear that this is the time. This is the time really to work on this and to find a meeting of IoT experts and disability experts to work together. And next we have disability and accessibility expert Shadi.
Yes, hello. My name is Shadi Abuzara. I'm the Accessibility Strategy and Technology Specialist at the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. And the topic of IoT is very important to W3C because we see the web as a platform. Technically, you could see it as an application living on the internet, but it has ultimately become the predominant interface to the internet. And if we look at the web more broadly as the term interface, as Vint was using, I think this could provide a huge opportunity. I think it was mentioned several times, IoT in itself is a huge enabler. I remember already years ago people using smart glasses and using them to recognize faces, which has all sorts of privacy issues, but the idea was actually just to recognize the emotions or the face expressions, and it was a blind researcher was actually giving a keynote presentation and looked at the person in the first row and said, "Why are you frowning?" And of course that was a very strange situation when a blind person is asking somebody why they have a certain face expression, and the glass enabled that by using the connectivity to the internet and all the big data and stuff in the background that goes along with IoT. So huge enablers, and I think really it's a potential here for very different kinds of assistive technologies than we've seen, a whole new generation of assistive technologies that could really enable things very differently. One of the big challenges that I see is the interoperability. I would put that even higher than reliability, because of experience, I've played around with one of these home assistants and put it in my living room and tried it out, and just and it could speak with my television very well, but it couldn't turn on the captions on the television. It couldn't know how to, even though the television had the captioning capability and the device understood what I wanted to do, but it didn't know how to turn on that command. So this is not only the user interface level, this is the interfacing between the devices, between the connected objects, where we right now have, I think, a situation where, more because of the business models, closed environments or semi-closed environments, you have to buy the right light bulb to go along with the right device, and if you have the wrong type of phone, you may not be able to access your fridge, or you know. So this lack of interoperability is a huge barrier to assistive technologies, and several times it was meant what people with disabilities need. The problem in a lot of these current IoT services is they sometimes offer accessibility features, but they will have predefined, like you're either deaf or you're blind or you're you know, certain kind of categories, but they do not consider cross disability aspects, deaf, blind, or blind and having a motor disability, or these combined disabilities that come often into play, where only customized solution and assistive technologies, and here this openness, open standards that we have currently on the traditional web, may I say, enable these custom assistive technologies, these custom accessing the data and the interfaces, and rendering it the way that the user needs it. Full access from the user interface level through all the cascades of different intermediaries on the way, which we currently don't have on the Internet of Things. And this is where, again, W3C is looking at the so-called Web of Things. This is not, it's not in any way a rephrasing of the Internet of Things, but it's the idea of, like, the traditional web is the interface to the traditional Internet. Could the Web of Things be the interface to the Internet of Things, and be this interoperable platform where different solutions and systems could actually really thrive like they've done on the traditional Internet? That's
Thank you very much, Shadi, and I'm fortunate to be sitting in between two accessibility experts here, so I'll pass it over to Andrea to provide some remarks.
Well, I thought, as I was listening to everybody, to share what happens when you don't have certain things. Like, I was a banker at the age of 2. I also was an expert on pharmaceuticals, because Mom and Dad, who were both deaf, who Vincent knows, or knew when they were alive, would take this 2-year-old, give it something to eat, and say, I want you to listen and tell me what they say. And I would do this without voice, and they would lip read me. Vint, you know about this. Anyway. So anyway, I go back to how people survive when they don't have these things. And there was a big drawback to that when I turned 14 years old. I was really not, yes, I didn't want to do it anymore. But I had an allowance, and that got cut if I was disrespectful, and that was quite often. So a lot of things, children are often the people that create accessibility for persons with disabilities. And though we ourselves don't think that's such a big deal, there are drawbacks to that on many levels. I mean, the bank's not going to. When I could talk more, I knew the banker, so the banker would allow me to speak for my mother, who didn't really want to get into that. But a lot of times, there's such certain barriers that can't be crossed. So you want to look at the human factor. One of the things that really excited me, a lot of people don't like the ITU because it's a weird place, and I will agree. But I went in there because they didn't know what they were doing. And they just started a study group on the Internet of Things. And lo and behold, these two Korean guys who were absolutely delightful found me, and I began to help them. And all we had to do was visualize what it would be like in a house if you couldn't do something. And like you were saying, you know, that what is it, you have one of those talking things, couldn't, communicate with the television. Well, I have a cat that is the most audible thing in the world. I might come home and find that there's been a delivery of 4 pints of milk outside my door because the cat ordered it. It's not, but the cat talks, and it has a running conversation with me when I'm on the phone. And if I'm away, I just say, put the cat on, and the cat will speak because it knows it's me. It's just weird. So I want people to think about accessibility as not as something that people in high places decide upon or make policy. I want everyone to think about what it would be like for yourself and anybody you can influence, whether you know somebody who works in an industry, because it's people who change what goes on. And a lot of times people who make things have a direct connection with a person with a disability. They either have family members or friends or something. And if those people can communicate to the people in industry who do not, that helps. The other problem is the misconception that it's not financially viable to do this. But I don't know, I get the idea if people really got it, it would be great to sit in your house, might get fat, and do everything, including your housework, without getting up. There are wonderful visions that could be done if people can use their imagination, and that's how things change. So I don't have any solutions because I'm not an IoT expert, but I have a good imagination, and that's what I would like to encourage people in this room to go away with, is come up with your own thoughts and ideas and communicate them. And that's the way things change, is through people.
I think using imagination and is key. That creates innovation, and so we have the opportunity in this room to talk about some of the potential benefits and applications for people with disability. So I'll open it up if Vint would like to start with some of those ideas. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I wanted to react to some of the things that have been said so far. One of them is, what is it about cats and the internet? They just keep coming up all the time. I just don't understand that. With regard to what drives innovation, one of the things that drives it is discontent with the status quo. And so I look for people who aren't satisfied. I mean, I don't want them whining all over the place, but people who are not satisfied with the status quo are the ones that make change. Now, we should take advantage of the fact that everybody at one time or another is likely to be somewhat disabled, whether you broke your leg and you're in a wheelchair or you have a cold and you can't hear. There are a variety of conditions that take people who are otherwise completely healthy and put them into a temporarily disabled category. It's amazing how that changes people's attitudes when they are suddenly confronted with, oh my God, I can't get down this stairway and I'm in a wheelchair. So temporary disability is part of the sales pitch, so keep that in mind. Another thing which we have to worry about with regard to IoT is this fire and forget kind of attitude. I built the device, I'm going to sell it to you, I'm not going to have anything to do with it anymore because I got my money out of it, and too bad if there are problems. We can't allow that to happen, and so we have to have some guidelines and rules that say, you know what, that's not acceptable. There is, however, this other wonderful positive potential. These devices are typically programmable, which means they can change. And my favorite example of this is my wife's Tesla, because she gets into the car and in the morning it says, guess what I can do now that I couldn't do yesterday because I've downloaded some new software. Now, honestly, it doesn't actually say that, but the screen pops up and says, here are the new things the car can do. This is actually a big opportunity. Software is creating flexibility that we didn't have in the past, and so this is a good thing. It leads to customization. And as someone mentioned 3D printing and things like that, that's an example of a technology that can lead to some customization of physical devices that are designed to fit your need. And so we are edging into a time when we can do more customization than we could before, either with 3D printing or reprogramming and the like. Now, there was some mention also of the data that is accumulated by these devices or detected by these devices. And I want you to keep in mind that privacy is an issue here. A webcam, which is not under control, can transmit its images to anywhere that the device is told to send them to. We don't want that to happen. You don't want your assistive devices to reveal private information that shouldn't be accessible to any except those you've authorized. And so that's another one of those lists of desirable properties that we need to keep in mind. The final point I wanted to make has to do with generality. Even if a device has been designed with a particular assistive need in mind, sometimes it turns out that that also satisfies some other requirements. And I think of captioning on the television, which many of us fought very long and hard for, turning out to be another wonderful tool for the teaching of English as a second language, for example. And so anytime you can figure out a way to take a special purpose device and turn it into something that has other applications, you may build a bigger market for it, which means you can drive cost out and make it affordable, accessible in the economic sense to a larger community. So those are all things that instantaneously come to mind as this conversation has unfolded.
That's quite true. When it comes to particular innovations that come out of assistive technology, we know, for example, the scanner came from the Kurzweil reading machine. We know speech recognition was a technology very, very expensive for people who couldn't use their arms to type on a keyboard. So there's huge potential for innovation in IoT for people with disability that can have these very much wider applications. Would someone else, Martin, please?
Yes, no, I think you're right. And I think also where Vint is taking us is also a little bit towards the future, where all this technology will become less visible for anybody, whether you have sharp eyes or not. And indeed, the language interface will become more natural and exactly what Vint said. One way is that things developed for people with less ability on interaction may be useful for those who don't have that hamper. At the same time, the other way around, I can see that it will be easier and easier to operate, particularly the consumer machines, because everybody has a problem with it. So taking it towards the future, I see that some of the problems we have today with accessibility will almost naturally disappear. But let's stay our eyes on the ball and make sure that we also continue to help there where the extra support is necessary, because it's not good enough.
Could I just make one mention of an example of something that's really surprised me? Our ability to understand speech, to recognize speech, and to translate it has gotten better and better. So Google recently announced some earbuds. And it's a hearing aid in a very interesting sense because it hears in languages that you don't speak. And that's an example of what happens when you get very creative about powerful software techniques.
Thank you, Gunilla. Satish, for the record. Two aspects of what has just been mentioned by Vint. One is that since we are living in an era of mass customization, it makes sense to have customized equipment that will kind of fight disability. We have a startup in our place which prints 3D prints ear buds that will accommodate to your specific ear. And I'm sure there are so many prosthetics which are also being 3D printed. So the potential to customize is actually quite high. Even the electronics, I'm sure, can be, because we have all these cheap boards like Arduino and others, Raspberry Pi and so on, wherein we can customize a lot at the grassroots level itself. And following on from there, the fact that manufacturers come and dump their products and go without recourse to maintenance and support and all that can be resolved to some extent by communities which are trying to do this work themselves. A typical example is open source communities which are helping out with software, but this one requires software and hardware. So we need to kind of develop these skills within our own communities also. Thank you.
Bhaskar, please.
Okay. My name is Bhaskar. I came from Bangladesh and I am the ISOC IGF ambassador here. So one thing, our government have launched some innovation fund that's called Service Innovation Fund. It is around $30,000 US. Anybody can apply for that. Any persons with disabilities or organization, they can apply for them. We found almost 14 innovation came throughout this fund. One already received the WSIS 2017 award, that is the multimedia talking books with online and offline version of the multimedia talking book. Another I can say we have innovated, that was accessible dictionary. So we have developed a dictionary that is available online. Anybody can access it. Primarily targeted to the blind people, but now everyone is using it. Almost we have counted 1 million people already use this dictionary. So, but primarily we targeted to the visual impaired people. And when we make something accessible for all, that could be benefited to everyone. So this is one thing I would like to request to the community to run a campaign to make a inclusive internet development, internet-based product development. Then everyone can enjoy their rights, and we don't need any special product for the persons with disability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Inclusive and universal design is the way we would like to go as much as possible. Andrea, did you want to?
I was just sitting here listening to the one concept that, Vinton, do you remember when the television manufacturers fought tooth and nail not to put captioning in their television sets? And now everybody does captioning in their television sets. And it wouldn't be, it's just not reasonable not to do it. And I think the point that has been made by these two gentlemen is if it is mainstreamed into regular society and we can look at the uses that would be applicable to us all, then we have a chance, because companies want to make money. They don't want to do niche things. Wouldn't you agree? And you know a lot about that.
Well, I was one of the guys on the battlefield, particularly fighting a peculiar situation where a simpler design was being essentially denigrated by a more complex one, which had much more beautiful symbols and colors and all this other stuff. And some of the television, it's not just the manufacturers, but it was also the television producers who were resisting the use of the simpler technology, essentially trying to put off into the future a particular implementation. And we basically fought them down, and I was very pleased about that.
Yes, Mubashir, please, from Pakistan. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. For the record, this is Muhammad Shabir. I actually have a couple of points. I think one of our earlier speakers mentioned that we actually need to know that what we want to achieve here. And it is very important. Last year, I remember that in Pakistan, we have had our regulator, telecom regulator, had a competition, mobile app award. The interesting thing about that award was that it was related to person with disabilities, that developers have to come up with ideas that were and develop the applications that would address the needs, any needs of any particular person with disability group. If there are multiple, good, but they will have to be addressed by someone. So what happened that we, with the help of Asia Pacific Internet Society Asia Pacific Bureau, we launched a project and ICT R&D fund. So we launched a campaign, a countrywide campaign. We organized workshops where we would bring together the developers and the person with disabilities, and developers would discuss their ideas with person with disabilities. And see that if there is a possibility. To cut the long story short, at the end, the application that was rated first and was given the prize, top prize by the President of Pakistan, was an idea based on IoT, and it was an idea that an app which would use hardware as well as software, and it will be it was a smart house idea, that you have a mobile app on your mobile. A person with disability who cannot use or he cannot walk, he can use that simple app using mobile. He or she can open doors, switch lights on or off, switch their ACs on and off. It can increase and decrease speeds. So this was the idea. My point here to make is that developers and the person with disabilities, the consumers, need to sit together, come together. There have been in my country, I have been a number of times called to test a device, that whether this would be useful for person with disabilities or not, after the device has been made. So I asked the first question to the developers, that where did your research came from? So I think it was very valid point raised by someone, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name, that we need developers and the person with disabilities need to sit together to formulate the way forward. Another thing that relates to the, I think, more of so-called developing world, and Ria, I know, doesn't like this word, but I may have to use it, is the awareness of what technology can do for person with disabilities and what person with disabilities can themselves do with the help of the technology. Let me give you here another example, that 3 years back, before December 2014, bankers would not allow a visually impaired person in Pakistan to carry credit card, to use ATM, or to use internet banking. They would require a person with visual impairment to visit the bank branch along with a witness who would write the check for them, and then the money would be issued. Now see here that it is the money by the own person. It's not the money. Banker is just the custodian, and his banker is requiring a visually impaired person to come with a witness to draw his or her own money. So we came to the State Bank, and they to add insult to the injury, they would say that they would claim that it's just for your protection. We are not doing it for ourselves. We want to protect you. So at the end of the day, we were able to convince them, and in December 2014, State Bank of Pakistan issued the guidelines that a person with disabilities or visual impairment specifically can carry credit cards and ATMs. Even now, when people with visual impairment go to the banks and demand these services, bankers would say that no, this will put you in more trouble. So my argument against this was that I would not be in trouble more than any other person would be using or carrying this credit card. So it's my risk to carry. It's my risk if I want to take this. Who are you? Yes, as a banker, you have the right to advise me, but you do not have the right to stop me from getting a service.
Yay!
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Actually, this is Vint again. I have to tell you, I had an experience like this. It was with my wife, Sigrid. We were trying to do something at Barclays Bank, and we had to do it remotely because that's in England and we're in the U.S. And Sigrid was having trouble hearing the person at the bank who had this weird British accent. So, sorry, if I've offended anyone, it was on purpose. So I said to I was there with her, and I said, may I repeat the questions for her in case she is having trouble understanding you? And they said no. They refused, and I said, well, I'm her husband, for one thing. It's not like I'm a criminal. Well, we don't know that. And then they said you have to use a teletype or something. Sigrid threw those away about 35 years ago because they took too long. The relay services were frustrating for her. And so we didn't make any progress at all. They absolutely refused to deal with us. And, of course, I took some action after that, and eventually we got it sorted out. But it's an example of people who think they know better than you do about what risks you are willing to take or what steps you're willing to take in order to work in an imperfect world.
Yes, it comes back to the independence and the rights of persons with disability. Absolutely. Francesca?
Gunilla. Thank you. Francesca Cesabianchi from G3SCT, which is a global initiative for inclusive technologies. I just wanted to make just a little comment on what Paul Timmers was saying earlier regarding conferences and so on. G3SCT has been co-organizing a conference. This is the 7th year, and we actually discussed since the early, actually since inception, key topics. And this year in particular, we are going to include IoT. We had approached that in the past, IoT for independent living and consumers, technology products, artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on. And we actually work with different partners, but especially also with the Consumer Technology Association, who is the organizer of CES in Las Vegas, and obviously many other partners. And I'm very glad to say that it's a preview announcement, but actually this year we will host Dr. Jaffe, CEO of W3C, as a keynote speaker. So I just wanted to say that, yeah, there are initiatives, and hopefully this could be of interest. And the conference will be in June 11th, 13th in Washington, D.C. next year. So thank you.
Already finished.
Perhaps I can, I want to react to Shadi's, I think, very important point about interoperability, because lack of interoperability leads to a lack of usability, and of course there's a lot more to be said about usability. And actually around interoperability, I think it's a particularly good topic to mobilize policy and non-policy tools. So kind of user-supplier cooperation, like Mohammed also said, open innovation, which can be stimulated by governments. You can actually also get money for that, because that's part of often of public research and innovation, or these kind of programs. But it's not limited, I think, only to these kind of private-public cooperations that are of a more voluntary nature. There is also, to some extent, a legal requirement for that. if you take data protection, at least in the European scene, there is a right to data portability, and you cannot realize data portability if you don't think about interoperability. So you are already having a pressure, a means to put pressure on the system to realize interoperability, even as to some degree as a legal obligation. Even more, business does have to some degree an interest in it, but sometimes it needs to be made explicit. One of the frustrations indeed in the assistive technology field is that all these companies are staying so small and so local. They don't actually go into the larger market. And one of the reasons for that is actually that the larger market is often fragmented. Well, in Europe, it's not permitted to fragment the larger market. This is illegal. So interoperability is a legal requirement if you want to enable to go into the larger market. That's also the basis, actually, of all of the legislation, like the web accessibility legislation. It's not actually a rights-based legislation. It's what we call an internal market, so it's an economic legislation. And then I think the real interesting thing, again, to come back to that, is actually what are you going to use that data for? Ultimately for a service, and there may be multiple uses of that. And there too, to some degree, I think people are starting to realize, hey, digital is going into all these sectors, and the boundaries between the sectors are starting to blur, between, say, energy and health is going to blur, between energy and mobility is going to blur. And so we will need to think about how can data flow from one sector to the other sector. And that is, again, brings it back very much to an interoperability issue. One of the more, I think, enlightened ways of thinking for that is happening actually in the electricity sector, where people have realized that if you want to do a good job in terms of sustainable energy production, so also consumers as producers of electricity, you will work with smart meters, but hey, the smart meters can also be used to transmit data that have to do with daily living, with mobility in the house, with mobility outside the house, with vital signs. And so actually there is a real pressure on the system to say we might be able to use the same data in the electricity system as in the health system or in the independent living system. And that again, I think, brings it back to very basic interoperability requirements that have also a good economic, sound economic interest behind them.
Yeah, I wanted to make 2 points. First is to reflect, I think, on the policy aspects that have been raised, and I do think that this is another very important piece of the puzzle that is a key enabler. We had this situation in Austria, where I live, where the national broadcaster was required to provide a certain amount of captioning, and they did. But when they put those materials on the video on demand, so online, they did not provide the captions there because they did not consider that as being broadcasting. Until there was the legal interpretation that also applies to streaming, and that's also a form of broadcasting or something. So what I'm saying is, I think a lot of the accessibility features that we're seeing are not because of the mainstreaming aspects. I think this sometimes comes after, where people actually see the benefits, but there is a lot of policy directing that happens here as well, that needs to happen, I think, also in future technologies. The other thing that I wanted to reflect on a little bit is the timing. I think we're a really key point in time here, where we have a unique opportunity. Very often accessibility things get developed, or technologies get developed, get deployed, and they are inaccessible, and then we have to chase and try to retroactively make them accessible. I think a lot of the questions that we're trying to figure out in how to make IoT accessible are challenges that are across the bench, security, privacy, and so on. These are not exclusively accessibility challenges. At the same time, accessibility, I think, can provide really interesting use cases here. For instance, regarding privacy aspects. The fridge that automatically tells you what you need to shop, which I think is really handy, is really good, because I always forget. I always come back from shopping having forgotten half the things that I should buy. At the same time, it can disclose so much information to your, to your shopping service, just alone by your dietary habits, maybe even diseases that you have, disabilities, and things like this. And this is something that maybe the mainstream may not immediately think of, what you're actually disclosing here. But by thinking of accessibility use cases and starting from that, we always say in user-centered design, if you actually have your target population, people with disabilities, you're going to actually get all the rest for free anyway. So when you're making usability studies, do it with people with disabilities. You're going to get all the extreme cases. Like when you're testing, you test with the extreme things to try to break your code, to debug it. And the rest comes for free anyway, basically, because I think accessibility highlights real situations that come back to benefit. So the timing aspect is, sorry, back again to the policy thing, I just wanted to mention also that G3ICT has a very interesting white paper, I believe, on the applicability of the UN CRPD to IoT. And I think this was a really interesting read to see, even though the CRPD is now several years old, that it's still, the spirit of it still applies also to future technologies such as IoT. And I think this is something that maybe the community should be looking at more closely.
May I ask a question on that?
Just quickly, we have remote. Do you?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now we have Jerry Ellis, who is going to speak to us remotely, and hopefully it will work. But you need to put on these earpieces, and so okay, if everyone could do that, and hopefully we will hear Jerry Ellis from Ireland speak to us. We hear you really well.
Yes.
Thank you, Jerry. Go ahead, and it's great to have you. Thank you so much, Jerry, for coming in remotely and making those valuable comments. I'm so pleased that we managed to include you remotely
And get WebEx to work.
and get WebEx to work. Yes, so that's great. Okay, we have another 20 minutes to go, and we have ranged across a lot of different areas here. I'm wondering, we are talking about IoT community, we're talking about the disability community, and that there needs to be maybe closer links. I'm wondering, we have a lot of key people here in the room. Are there ways that we can find to collaborate? For example, we have Google here, we have W3C, we have a range of people from civil society as well. We have heard the importance of involving people with disability in development, to work closely with developers, and the importance of that to get it right from the start, and about extreme testing, and people with disability can certainly contribute there. So I'm wondering, can we discuss any way that possibly we can look at that collaboration?
Well, this is just an idea, and it's speaking specifically to the web-type interfaces. It has occurred to some of us that it would be very interesting if every IoT device had its own web page. You know, when it's created, it has a web page. And the web page is accessible only to the party who is supposed to be having control over that device. So you can imagine some cryptographic methods that are generated as a consequence of acquiring the device and getting some sort of a cryptographic key created that you have access to. But I bring this up because there's this interesting possibility that the web page associated with the device is the way in which you configure it. And so if there were regularity about the way in which you manage these devices based on some standards, we might be able to manage ensembles of devices on a more regular basis. And I mean, this is just a very not well thought out notion. You can imagine if you sell the device, you sort of transfer authority to the web page to whoever acquires it, or a collection of devices. And so it's little ideas like that that create commonality that can actually go quite a long ways towards making the manufacturers of these things accidentally create uniformity for you, even though the controls may be very different. We're seeing something similar happening right now. Amazon and Google and others have ways of telling devices what they're supposed to do, commands. I think they're called skills at Amazon, and they're called, actions with Google in my company. But they actually all boil down to a list of things that the device is capable of responding to. And so if we could standardize what those things are, there's a place called schema.org where there is cooperation going on to create these sets of identifiers associated with functionality. Once again, a tool for creating commonality among the diversity of companies and devices that are being created. I have one other anecdote to tell you, if you could tolerate it. It has to do with the, I would say, the proliferation of voice-based interfaces. Everyone has gotten utterly fascinated by talking to Alexa or Google Home or Siri or something else. And I consider this to be interesting but not adequate, not satisfactory. And the reason for this is quite simple. Imagine that you're sitting in a room with as many light bulbs as this one has, and you're trying to get the room or the house to turn on just a couple of them. How do you refer to the lights that you want to turn off and on? Do you have to give them names like George and Frank and Eddie? And then turn Freddie off and turn George on. How do you introduce your guests to the house? How does the house know, which guests are allowed to do which things, and how do you train the guests to do that? I mean, I don't want to have a lengthy debate with my house about which light I'm trying to turn on or which toilet I'm trying to flush. And so, I mean, we literally need to think our way through the scaling properties of having numbers of devices. So many engineers are fascinated with mobile, internet, app, device, end of story. And if you have a lot of devices at home that are internet enabled, you don't want to go flipping through 800 of them on your mobile to figure out, how to open the refrigerator. So there is a scaling issue here, in addition to the diversity of things we're going to have to do to make these things accessible. And I'm afraid not enough people are actually thinking their way through these deployment scenarios, especially at scale. By the way, there's another little problem. There's parents and children, and sometimes you don't want the children to have the same authorities that the parents do, except in this day and age, the kids know how to get around the controls better than the parents do, so much for that theory. When your guests leave, how do you unintroduce the house to them so they can't do things when they're away that they shouldn't be able to do? These are not specifically associated with disabilities, but they're associated with control of the devices. It just gets more complicated now when somebody comes to visit your home who happens to have a disability. How does the system adapt to that? And actually, that's a scenario that I had not frankly thought about until just now. Thank you for letting me be here to think of that, because that's a whole new dimension now where your house is all set, it works great, you know how to get the lights off and on and the heater to go and the doors to unlock. And suddenly a friend shows up who needs assistance in using your house. And you didn't think of that until they arrived at the front door. Now what?
Well, this is a wonderful opportunity to work on that mainstreaming, including accessibility in mainstream smart homes. Shadi, did you have any comments to
Just
make?
very quickly, yes, indeed there is activities at W3C on Web of Things, and what you were saying there earlier, Vint, that's exactly the idea. Only the web page, and I know you know Tim very well, is not a human readable page, but it's a data. He sees the web as a series of data flows, and so you have descriptions for the object, as we call it, because it could even be a sensor. It could be something that is not even a light bulb. It's some. It would disclose its properties and what you could do with it, and that's the idea. That's the trying to build here a platform, such a foundation, so that other things could plug in and say, okay, I have these light bulbs here, and I will abstract that, and instead of Freddy and all these other names that you mentioned, it will just be called, I don't know, evening mood and I don't know, daylight something, you know, and simplify that on an abstract level, right? And you could have these cascades of things. That's the idea.
Mohammed, please.
Yes. Yeah, the comment about the talking to the house is very enriching. It gives us a very fertile food for thought, but I'm not going to comment on that. I will take you a bit back where someone, in fact, it was Shadi who mentioned issues related to the policy processes and the IoT and technology development. Yes, policies, sometimes there are very big problems with the policies. That's why I mentioned there when I was there at WTDC, I write in my often this line that their accessibility should not be the standalone or an independent venture. It has to be what we are seeing here in the house is mainstreamed, or it has to be incorporated in policy, planning, and design. It has to be everywhere. It cannot be a standalone venture, and then again we can claim that we have made our digital things or whatever accessible. It would be much more difficult, much more costly, and time taking as well. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, please.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking we ended our discussion in the Internet of Things Dynamic Coalition on the need for taxonomy on safety, security and privacy. And what comes up for me is it's very important also not to hinder ourselves to develop applications that help people that really need them. I remember having seen an advert from an American firm where they have this amazing home that fully observes your parents 24/7 and helps with all kind of tools to make sure everything goes right. And my first reaction was, shit, I wouldn't want to be in an environment like that. Now my mother is suffering from, what's it called? Alzheimer. My father is struggling with keeping her to help. I can see how this is not a pleasant solution, but this would allow them to live their deepest wish, which is stay at home in a different way. So if we legally exclude that this is possible, because of whatever reasons, we also shoot ourselves in the foot. So let's be sensitive for that. That's my call on that.
Yeah, something about the bridging between the IoT and disability, accessibility, inclusion community. As I said in the beginning also, I think it's quite important that we have these cases that illustrate in a lively way what's actually the issue at stake. And I think here at the table several very interesting, well-illustrated cases have actually been mentioned. And that needs to be communicated to the IoT community. And I kind of wrote down what would be key performance indicators for next year talking about this topic. Well, I think I would like to see that it's not only in G3 ICT, but that there are other places where accessibility and IoT is really taken up, and why not, as a matter of fact, request these conferences that are going on to include this as a topic. That could be one possibility, together with a few of these cases that illustrate in a lively and recognizable way for people personally what it is about, because then you have the personal appeal. And I must say, I think it's also worthwhile to think a little bit about the words that we use, because, you know, in other areas like privacy, we've got privacy by design. People start to flesh that out, that people get a picture of what that might mean. Security by design. Here, for a long time, we have had the design for all. But I'm not sure whether that as a word ticks sufficiently with the IoT community. So the Dynamic Coalition could continue the debate, I guess, and find kind of, sometimes you also need to find the right word that strikes and that people find recognizable. Is it inclusive IoT? I don't know. Is it IoT for all? Is it human-centered IoT? Something that is then used as a common term, and you will find it back.
Okay, thank you. I tried to do something, I have done it, but not completely. I have written for the ITU a dictionary on accessibility terms. And every time, and actually you helped me with this, we come to something, somebody would object to it. There is also the situation where Jerry pointed out that the term is universal design, not design for all, because that's the one in the UN. Terminology is very important. We've gotten rid of things like deaf and dumb. We've gotten rid of that one, but there are plenty of other ones that we haven't gotten rid of, and I have to keep reminding myself that what you say is so significant. So I agree with you on one hand, but we can do it in one language. We did it in English. Other languages, for instance, in French, it's handicapé. If you say that in English, you're a dead person. So I don't know how we can find a term. I think we have to coexist with what we've got. But the main thing is that I think is a very important situation is to remind people who do not think they have a disability or who do not have a disability that when they get nice and old, and I freak out realizing how old I am, because I'm 70 this year, going on 71, and I go, what? how did I live so long? And I'm finding that parts are falling off. Well, I have a cane now and one replaced knee, and I just got my glasses changed 6 months ago. Excuse me, I need another pair. So the thing is, the emphasis for young people who are in control of us today, that they have to remember that they're going to get to have gray hair, wrinkles, and bad knees and everything else. And they don't realize that. And the point is, accessibility does affect everybody at some stage, as you said, Vincent.
Okay, look, I think we've had a fantastic conversation here about IoT and accessibility. Thank you very much for all your input. I will try and just summarize a few of the key points, and I know I'm going to miss a few. But we've heard about involvement of people with disability in design, working with developers. We've heard about the importance of reliability, global standards, coding, involvement of accessibility in IoT conferences, and the free flow of data. How timely is this to really incorporate accessibility in all of these IoT developments that are happening? And we have the same issues we have in general IoT discussions about privacy and security, ethical issues. They need to be addressed in terms of accessibility for people with disability as well. Interoperability, of course, is vital when it comes to assistive technology, and really the various devices that should be talking to each other in various ways. Are they really effectively going to do that? And let's see, we want to ensure that accessibility is incorporated in mainstream IoT development as much as possible. But then we come back to the interoperability of assistive devices when we need to. And we've talked about terminology, the control of devices, and functionality, of course, is very important. So there are so many issues here that we can go away with and work with in our own organizations and with our own networks. But let's try and continue this discussion online so that we can mesh this general IoT developments with accessibility. And the Dynamic Coalition is a great place to do that. What?
Last word from Vincent.
So I'm sure I've missed things, but I was wondering, did Vint want to make any closing remarks? No? Okay. Any other last minute comments before we close? Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Great. Okay.
I was hoping you'd say something else.
No, well.
They did fine.
Yeah.
I am.
Do you do one more thing to put it back on? Thank you to the captioner. Thank you.
Yes, yes. I do bump into email from time to time, but this is now much more, parliament and stuff.
Which could do is you should visit to my wife.
Hello, oh, nice to meet you. Very nice to
Actually,
meet you.
we were working together 10 years ago. And didn't see each other for a long
He
time.
was saying all the things about the directors, like, yes, I remember. I remember all the pain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the work that you did actually really got close. I mean, that's
Right,
exceptional.
yeah.
Oh, yes.
The other people that may be of quite some interest. So in the Dynamic Coalition is also Arthur van der Wees, who is again in the
Arthur.
von der Wees,
Okay.
is this lawyer who has been in several of the sections.
Okay.
Martin also knows him well. And he is one of the founders of this IoT Alliance for IoT Innovation. And they are the ones that actually reasonably seriously looked at accessibility. So they might be actually quite a good lever because they take it serious, but they don't have the answers. But and it's very kind of industrial. You know, there's a lot of money floating around there. You know,
It's
I think
very dispersed right now. There isn't one central organization on that. That's the issue. Yeah.
But
So, yeah.
there you may
Yeah.
get some, and I will also pass the message to them,
Yeah.
some leverage, and
Yeah.
they do also some stuff around large-scale pilots and those kind of things, more on independent living, where they again did the same analysis of also of accessibility. So I think that's kind of like an opportunity to bring in a bit more in, and that's not managed by the team of Macro, although I think they are working back to back, but that's the team of, I don't know if you were this morning in the session about IoT regulation.
No, I missed it unfortunately. No,
Okay,
yeah.
that's Piers O'Donnell, who is now the director there, and he is also responsible for a big part of the research program.
Okay.
So that's probably a good entry point.
Okay. Okay. That's very good advice. Yeah.
Everybody wants a picture with him.
With Vint, yeah, of course.
He's a celebrity.
Father of the web, of the internet.
He sees them often, I think.
Not often, but I've been on
But he's working also with Tim Berners-Lee, who is
the last celebration of W3C to 25 years. He had a T-shirt written on it, "I did not invent the web," and Tim had a T-shirt, "I did not invent the internet." They always get confused.
I heard from. Do you also know George Metakidis? Do you remember him? Perhaps, okay, because he has also quite good contacts apparently with Tim Berners-Lee, and he has been mentioning the initiative of the Web of Things also more than once.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm not
Yeah, I want to go to
as
that.
closely involved in the Web of
And,
Things, but basically the paper that you saw.
so that's
That
8
was the
o'clock
start.
it finishes.
That was a communication paper to the
So
Web for All
if we
conference
can
last
pick
year.
us up.